before the 1,000 ships broke the horizon, and before the bronze armor gleamed under the merciless sun, there was only the silence of the stone. Here, where the currents of the Hellespont clash with the Aegean Sea, the wind has whispered the same secrets for millennia. This is not just a story of a war. It is the memory of the earth itself, remembering a time when gods walked among men and a city stood so proud that it dared to touch the sky. This is the story of Troy before the first arrow was ever released. The geography of the ancient world is written not in ink, but in the rugged contours of the land and the relentless flow of the water. To understand the tragedy that would unfold here, one must first understand the stage upon which it was set. In the northwest corner of Anatolia, there lies a region known as the Troad. It is a land defined by its strategic dominance, a gateway between the east and the west, guarding the narrow strait that separates the continents. The ancients called this strait the Hellespont. It is a turbulent body of water, a river in the sea, rushing tirelessly from the vast Euxine in the north down to the open Aegean. For centuries, mariners feared these currents, often forced to wait in the bays near the mouth of the strait for the favorable southerly winds to carry them upward. It was here, at this crucial juncture of patience and power, that the hill of Hizarlik rose from the plain. The hill itself was not particularly high, appearing more like a gentle mound rising from the fertile valleys surrounding it. Yet, its position commanded the entire plain. To the west lay the sea, stretching out towards the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, dark shapes resting on the glittering horizon. To the south rose the majestic peaks of Mount Ida, the Gargaros, often shrouded in a veil of mist and clouds. This was the mountain of the gods, a place of abundant springs and wild beasts, where the pine forests grew thick and the air was crisp and cool. From the slopes of Ida, 2 rivers flowed down to wash the Trojan plain, the Simois and the Scamander. The Scamander was a warm, winding river, its banks lined with reeds and elm trees, its waters feeding the rich soil that allowed the horses of the Troad to grow strong and swift. In this era, long before the chaos of the siege, the city of Troy, Iliad as it was sung in the verses, sat atop its hill like a crown of stone. The walls were its most defining feature. They were not merely defensive structures. They were architectural marvels, engineered with a precision that baffled the mind. Great blocks of limestone, perfectly hewn and fitted together without mortar, rose at a steep angle, creating a barrier that seemed insurmountable. These fortifications were so imposing that legends would later claim they were built by the hands of Poseidon and Apollo, laboring under the command of King Laomedon. The sun would strike these white stones in the morning, making the city glow as if it were illuminated from within, a beacon visible to any ship daring to navigate the straits. Life within and around these walls was a rhythm of peace and prosperity. The wind was the constant companion of the Trojans. It blew incessantly from the north, sweeping over the ramparts, whistling through the narrow streets of the citadel, and rustling the leaves of the great oak trees that dotted the landscape. The lower town, spreading out from the base of the citadel, was a hive of activity, yet it possessed a serene order. Potters turned their wheels, shaping the gray minion where that would carry oil and wine to distant lands. Weavers sat at their looms, creating textiles dyed in vibrant purples and reds, sourced from the murex shells found along the coast. The air smelled of roasting meat, dried herbs, and the salty tang of the nearby sea. Outside the protection of the walls, the plain was a patchwork of agricultural mastery. Farmers tended to fields of wheat and barley, their movements slow and deliberate under the Anatolian sun. Herds of cattle and sheep grazed on the lush grasses near the riverbanks, their bells chiming softly in the afternoon breeze. There was no sense of impending doom in this landscape. The horizon was empty of enemy sails. The beaches were pristine, unmarked by the keels of black ships or the footprints of invading armies. The only invaders were the migratory birds passing overhead and the merchant vessels that paid toll to the king of Troy for safe passage through the straits. The palace of King Priam stood at the highest point of the citadel, a complex of megarons with wide hearths and timber columns. It was a place of accumulated wealth, where gold from the east and ivory from the south found a home. In the cool, shadowed halls, the royal family lived in a state of blessed ignorance of the fate that the fates were spinning for them. The stone floors were polished smooth by generations of feet, and the walls were adorned with frescoes depicting hunts and rituals, not war. The silence of the palace at night was profound, broken only by the distant barking of a dog or the hooting of an owl from the ravines of Mount Ida. This was the world of the Bronze Age at its zenith, a world where connection and trade flourished, where the balance of power seemed as solid as the walls of Troy themselves. But the wind that cooled the brow of the farmer and filled the sails of the merchant ship was the same wind that would eventually bring the fire. For now, however, the land slept. The Scamander flowed gently to the sea. The gods on Mount Ida watched indifferently. And the great city stood tall, a monument to human endeavor, unaware that it was destined to become a monument to human sorrow. The dust of the plain lay undisturbed, waiting for the blood that would turn it into mud. This was the calm before the storm that would echo for eternity. To understand the fire that would eventually devour the stone towers of Ilion, one must first retreat to a time of profound quiet, to a place far removed from the dust of the battlefield. The story begins not in the palaces of men, but in the wild, untamed embrace of nature, on the rugged slopes of Mount Pelion. It was a landscape of ancient grandeur, where the forests of chestnut and beech trees grew so thick that the sunlight struggled to touch the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight of cool greens and earthy browns. Moss covered the great boulders that had tumbled down from the peaks in ages past, softening their sharp edges, while ferns unfurled their delicate fronds in the damp shadows. This was the domain of the centaur Chiron, the wise teacher of heroes, and it was here, in a vast cave opening towards the sea, that the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis was set. Peleus was a mortal king, a man of noble lineage and brave heart, but he was merely a man, subject to the ravages of time and the inevitability of death. Thetis, his bride, was of a different order entirely. She was a Nereid, a daughter of the salt water, immortal and ageless, her skin shimmering with the pearlescent luster of the inside of a seashell. Their union was a bridge between the ephemeral and the eternal, a rare convergence that drew the attention of the entire cosmos. The preparations for the feast had transformed the rugged cave into a hall fit for divinity. Garlands of wild laurel, interwoven with white lilies and fragrant herbs, hung from the rocky ceiling, filling the air with a scent that was both sharp and sweet. The tables were long slabs of polished wood, laden with the bounty of the earth and the sea. Grapes dark as night, honeycombs dripping with gold, loaves of bread baked with anise and coriander, and silver platters piled high with pomegranates and figs. The guests arrived not with the clatter of chariot wheels, but with the silent majesty of the supernatural. From the depths of the ocean came the sisters of Thetis, rising from the waves like foam, their hair wet and tangled with sea flowers, bringing with them the cool, briny scent of the deep. From the high peaks of Olympus descended the 12 great gods, their feet barely touching the ground. Zeus, the father of gods and men, entered with a presence that seemed to thicken the air, his beard like storm clouds, his eyes holding the terrifying calm of the sky before thunder. Beside him walked Hera, the queen of the heavens, draped in robes woven from the fibers of peacock's feathers, her head held high under a diadem of beaten gold. Poseidon came with the smell of the storm, his trident resting easily in his hand, while Apollo, the golden-haired archer, brought with him a light that seemed to banish the shadows of the cave. They took their places on couches covered with the furs of leopards and lions. The feast proceeded with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The wine poured into the jeweled goblets was not the wine of men, but nectar, the drink of the gods, a liquid that glowed with an internal ruby light and banished all fatigue and sorrow. The food was ambrosia, lighter than air, melting on the tongue like a sweet mist. Apollo took up his lyre, and the music that flowed from the strings was so pure, so mathematically perfect, that the birds in the trees outside ceased their singing to listen, and the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a moment of absolute perfection, a tableau of harmony where the mortal and the divine feasted together in peace. However, in the vast catalogue of invited guests, one name had been deliberately omitted. Eris, the goddess of discord, the sister of war, she who walks in the shadows of conflict and sows the seeds of bitterness. She had been left behind, forgotten in the dark spaces between the stars, for her presence was known to curdle joy and turn laughter into arguments. But the exclusion of a deity is a dangerous act, for their memories are long and their pride is infinite. Eris did not storm the cave with an army. She did not scream or rage. She arrived unseen, a shadow within the shadows, a cold draft that made the torches flicker and dim for a heartbeat. She stood at the threshold of the feast, watching the merriment with eyes that saw the fragility of peace. With a movement as subtle as a viper sliding through dry grass, she cast her gift onto the central table. It was not a weapon, but a fruit, a single apple, forged from solid gold, heavy and cold. It rolled slowly across the wooden surface, the sound of its movement a low, ominous rumble that cut through the music of the lyre. It came to a rest in the center of the feast, gleaming under the torchlight, a perfect sphere of avarice. Upon its curved, shining surface, a single phrase was inscribed in letters that seemed to burn, "For the fairest." The music stopped. The conversation died. The silence that descended upon the wedding was not the peaceful silence of the forest, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a gathered storm. The eyes of the goddesses turned to the gold. In that instant, the camaraderie of the feast evaporated. 3 hands reached out, drawn by the magnetic pull of vanity. Hera, who believed that her status as queen gave her dominion over all qualities, including beauty. Athena, who believed that the perfection of the mind and the strategic arts constituted the only true form of beauty. And Aphrodite, who was the very incarnation of desire, the force that makes the blood run hot. The dispute that followed was not fought with swords, but with glares and the terrifying weight of divine will. The air in the cave grew hot and oppressive. The mortal guests, including King Peleus, shrank back in fear, for the anger of the gods is a fire that consumes the bystander. Zeus, sitting at the head of the table, looked upon the 3 goddesses and saw the trap. To choose one was to make enemies of the other 2, an enmity that would last for eternity. The king of the gods, in his infinite caution, refused to speak. He would not be the judge. He decreed, instead, that the burden of this impossible choice would fall upon a mortal. He named a shepherd who lived on the distant slopes of Mount Ida, a man named Paris, who was known for his fair judgment of bulls and rams, unaware that he was a prince of Troy by birth. The scene shifts now, away from the cool, mossy forests of Pelion, across the Aegean Sea, to the sun-baked landscape of the Troad. Mount Ida was a different world entirely. Here, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the rocky slopes where the pine trees bled sticky resin and the air vibrated with the relentless, monotonous buzzing of cicadas. The light was harsh and white, bleaching the color from the stones. Paris sat in the shade of a twisted olive tree, watching his flock of sheep graze on the dry, yellowed grass. He was alone, miles from the nearest settlement, his only companions the wandering clouds and his dog. He played a simple tune on a reed pipe, the notes drifting lazily into the empty air, a melody of boredom and contentment. His solitude was broken not by a sound, but by a light. The air in front of him began to shimmer, warping like heat haze on the horizon. The 3 goddesses descended, not in their terrifying giant forms, but in the guise of mortal women of surpassing beauty, yet retaining an aura of power that made the sheep bleat in panic and scatter. Hermes, the messenger god with winged sandals, stood before the trembling shepherd and presented the golden apple, relaying the command of Zeus. Paris, a simple man living a simple life, found himself holding the weight of the world's fate in his calloused hand. The goddesses did not wait for him to speak. They began to offer their bribes, their voices like music that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. Hera stepped forward first. She offered him power. She spoke of kingdoms, of a throne that would elevate him above all other men. She promised him dominion over the rich lands of Asia and the fortress cities of Europe. She painted a vision of him wearing a crown of iron and gold, with armies marching at his command. His name carved into monuments that would last until the mountains crumbled. Then Athena approached. She offered him wisdom and victory. She looked into his eyes and promised him a mind that could unravel the complexities of the universe, a strategic brilliance that would make him undefeated in battle. She offered him the glory of the hero, the satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and competence, where no enemy could outwit him and no problem could remain unsolved. Finally, Aphrodite moved closer. She did not speak of armies or maps or books. She loosened the golden girdle at her waist, and the air filled with the scent of roses and musk. She offered him love. She leaned in and whispered a story of a woman across the sea, Helen of Sparta, a woman whose beauty was a mirror of the goddess herself. She promised him not a kingdom of stone, but a kingdom of the heart. She promised him passion that would burn with the intensity of the sun, a connection that would defy duty, honor, and nations. She offered him the possession of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris looked at the golden apple in his hand. He looked at the distant horizon where the city of Troy lay sleeping. He was young, and his blood was hot, and the allure of power and wisdom seemed cold and abstract compared to the visceral promise of Aphrodite. In the silence of the mountain afternoon, with the cicadas screaming their witness, Paris made his choice. He extended his hand and placed the golden apple in the palm of Aphrodite. The wind on the mountain seemed to stop instantly. Hera and Athena vanished, their forms dissolving into the heat, but the air where they had stood remained freezing cold, charged with a hatred that would span 10 years of slaughter. Aphrodite smiled, a smile of triumph and promise, and then she too was gone. Paris was left alone once more under the olive tree. The sheep returned to their grazing. The sun continued its slow arc towards the west. To the observer, nothing had changed, but the invisible threads of destiny had been pulled tight. The promise was made, the bribe was accepted, and the first step towards the burning of Troy had been taken. The shepherd picked up his pipe, but the tune he played now was lost to the wind, carried away towards the sea where the black ships would soon gather. The promise made on the sun-drenched slopes of Mount Ida was not a thing of vapor or dream. It was a binding contract forged by divine will, demanding manifestation in the mortal world. Paris, once content with the simple solitude of the shepherd's life, now found a different kind of fire burning within him. The reed pipe was cast aside, replaced by the gilded armor befitting a prince of Troy. The song of the cicadas was replaced by the rhythmic thud of axes biting into ancient timber. At the foot of the mountains, where the pine forests met the sea, the shipyards of Iliad came alive with a singular purpose. The construction of Paris's fleet was a labor of surpassing craftsmanship, yet it was watched with heavy hearts by the elders of the city. The wood chosen was the finest Phrygian pine, felled from high altitudes where the air was thin and cold, ensuring a grain that was tight and resilient against the rot of the sea. The keels were laid from single, massive trunks of oak, seasoned for years to prevent warping. For weeks, the air near the coast was thick with the pungent, sharp aroma of heating pitch and tar, used to caulk the seams between the planks, making the vessels watertight. The sails were woven from the strongest flax, bleached white by the sun, and dyed at their edges with the deep purple of the murex shell, signifying a royal voyager. These were not ships built for trade or warfare. They were grand pleasure crafts, designed to impress foreign courts and to carry a cargo of destiny across the dividing sea. When the day of departure arrived, the omens were ambiguous. The smoke from the sacrifices at the altar of Apollo rose straight, yet a palpable sense of foreboding hung over the harbor. King Priam embraced his son, seeing the splendid vision of a prince, unaware that he was sending forth the instrument of his own city's destruction. Paris boarded the flagship, its prow carved in the likeness of Aphrodite. The mooring ropes, heavy with brine, were cast off from the stone bollards. The oarsmen, their muscles shining with sweat and oil, bent to their task in unison. The great ships moved slowly at first, then gathered momentum, their bronze-clad rams cutting through the calm waters of the Hellespont, leaving the safety of Troy behind them. The voyage across the Aegean was eerie in its tranquility. It was as if the sea itself, often treacherous and moody, had been smoothed flat by the unseen hand of the goddess who sponsored this journey. For days, they sailed under a sky of unbroken blue, the sun tracing a lazy arc overhead. At night, the canopy of stars wheeled slowly above the mast, the constellations guiding the helmsman unerringly toward the Peloponnese. There were no storms, no contrary winds to delay their progress. The rhythmic dipping of the oars into the wine-dark water was a hypnotic metronome, counting down the leagues to a fateful encounter. The retinue of Paris, dressed in embroidered silks and bearing gifts of wrought gold, sat on the decks, looking towards a horizon that held an unknown future. They made landfall in Laconia, the southern heartland of Greece, at the port of Gythion. The landscape here was markedly different from the rolling plains of the Troad. It was a harsher land, defined by the imposing, saw-toothed range of the Taygetus Mountains that loomed in the west, guarding the fertile valley of the Eurotas River. The journey inland to Sparta was through groves of gnarled olive trees and fields of ripening grain, following the riverbanks where tall reeds swayed in the warm breeze. The palace of Menelaus, king of Sparta and son of Atreus, rose from the Acropolis, a fortress palace in the grand Mycenaean tradition. It was a structure built for power and defense, yet adorned with immense wealth. Its walls were constructed of Cyclopean stones, fitted together with brute precision. The grand entrance gate was flanked by columns of red porphyry and guarded by lions carved from limestone. Passing through the courtyards, one entered the Megaron, the great central hall. Here, a massive circular hearth dominated the center of the room, its fire casting a flickering, warm glow on the four fluted timber columns that supported the roof. The walls were not bare stone but were plastered and painted with vibrant frescoes in blues, ochres, and reds, depicting scenes of lion hunts, figure-of-eight shields, and processionals of women bearing offerings. Menelaus received his Trojan guests with the overwhelming generosity demanded by the sacred laws of Xenia, the guest friendship protected by Zeus himself. He was a mighty king, red-haired and broad-shouldered, a man of straightforward honor and immense wealth, possessing treasures of gold, electrum, and polished bronze brought back from distant lands. He knew nothing of the judgment on Mount Ida, nothing of the goddess's promise. He saw only a charming, beautiful prince from a prosperous neighboring city. Paris and his retinue were bathed by servants in polished bronze tubs, anointed with perfumed oils scented with iris and rose, and dressed in fresh tunics of soft wool before being led to the feast. Tables laden with roasted meats, baskets of bread, and golden mixing bowls filled with wine were set before them. A bard, blind and aged, sat in the corner, strumming a lyre and singing ancient epics of gods and earlier heroes. It was into this atmosphere of sated comfort and masculine camaraderie that she entered. Helen, queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda. Her entrance was not marked by fanfares, but by a sudden, collective intake of breath in the hall. The conversation died instantly. Even the bard's fingers paused over the strings of his lyre. She moved through the Megaron with a grace that seemed almost liquid, her feet making no sound on the polished gypsum floor. She was dressed in robes of shimmering white, woven from a fabric so fine it seemed like spun mist, held at the shoulders by golden fibulae crafted in the shape of sphinxes. Her beauty was not merely a matter of symmetrical features or flawless skin. It was an elemental force, a radiating presence that altered the perception of everyone in the room. It was a beauty that felt almost dangerous to behold directly. Her hair was the color of spun gold in the firelight, and her eyes held the depth and shifting color of the sea at twilight. She carried with her a subtle scent, not of heavy perfumes, but something fresher, like wildflowers after a rain, mixed with an inexplicable hint of something divine. She took her seat beside Menelaus on her ivory-inlaid throne, her presence dominating the grand hall more completely than any king could. Across the hearth fire, the eyes of Paris and Helen met. It was a moment suspended in time, ignored by the others who returned to their wine and meat. In that gaze, there was no need for words. The promise of Aphrodite, abstract until this moment, solidified into an undeniable reality. It was a recognition of two beings drawn together by forces beyond mortal comprehension, a magnetism that ignored duty, marriage vows, and the peace of nations. The air between them seemed charged, heavy with unspoken intent. Helen, bored by the provincial life of Sparta and the straightforward nature of her husband, saw in Paris an exotic beauty, a refinement, and a desperate passion that she had never known. Paris saw the living embodiment of the Golden Apple's prize. Fate, always an opportunist, provided the necessary opening. News arrived from Crete that demanded the immediate attention of King Menelaus. Bound by duty and trusting implicitly in the sacred bonds of guest friendship, he bid farewell to his wife and his charming Trojan guest, entrusting Paris to Helen's care until his return. He sailed away, leaving the fox to guard the henhouse, ignorant of the catastrophe that was already unfolding under his own roof. The departure from Sparta was not a frantic, chaotic abduction as some later songs would claim. It was a calm, deliberate, and terrifyingly quiet affair carried out under the cloak of a moonless night. The palace slept, sedated by wine and the security of peace. Paris and Helen moved through the shadowed corridors like ghosts. They did not leave empty-handed. Along with the queen, the Trojan retinue emptied the treasuries of Menelaus, carrying chests overflowing with gold talents, silver tripods, and heavy bronze cauldrons down to the waiting ships at Gythion. It was a dual theft of a wife and a fortune that would ensure the wrath of Greece would be total. Helen boarded the Trojan flagship, the one with the goddess carved on the prow. She looked back only once at the dark outline of the Spartan coast, a land she would never see again. The oars dipped silently into the black water. The sails were unfurled, catching the night breeze that blew steadily from the west, a wind that seemed to be hurrying them toward their destiny. The ships turned their prows toward Troy, carrying a cargo that would set the world on fire. Behind them, the palace of Menelaus stood silent and empty, waiting for the dawn that would bring the realization of the ultimate betrayal. The dawn that broke over the Eurotas Valley did not bring the warmth of the sun, but the cold, gray realization of loss. When Menelaus returned from Crete to find his palace stripped of its treasures and his hearth empty of its queen, the cry that escaped his throat was not merely one of personal grief. It was a sound that would dismantle the peace of the Bronze Age. The laws of hospitality, the sacred bedrock upon which civilization rested, had been shattered by the Trojan prince. This was no longer a matter of a stolen wife. It was an insult to every king in Greece who held his honor dearer than his life. The messengers were dispatched before the sun had reached its zenith, riding horses lathered in sweat, carrying the call to arms to the four corners of the Aegean world. The summons flew first to Mycenae, the lion city, where Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus and the high king of all Achaeans, sat upon his throne. He was a man of immense ambition, a ruler who had long looked across the water at the controlling power of Troy with a covetous eye. The abduction of Helen was the spark he had been waiting for, the perfect pretext to unite the fractious warlords of Greece under a single banner and crush the rivals who guarded the Hellespont. The beacons were lit on the citadels, signal fires leaping from mountain peak to mountain peak, a chain of flame writing the declaration of war across the night sky. From the rocky island of Ithaca came Odysseus, a man of wit and guile, who had tried to evade the summons by feigning madness, sowing his fields with salt. But destiny, in the form of Palamedes, had unmasked his ruse, and he too was drawn into the gathering storm, bringing with him 12 ships and a mind sharper than any bronze blade. From the sandy Pylus came Nestor, the old charioteer, his beard white with age but his voice still commanding respect in the council of kings. From the fortified walls of Tiryns came Diomedes, the master of the war cry. And from the hidden valleys of Phthia, the Myrmidons were roused, the ant-men fierce and disciplined, led by the greatest warrior ever to draw breath, Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, he whose name was synonymous with death. The gathering place was Aulis, a sheltered bay in Boeotia where the straits between the mainland and the island of Euboea narrowed. Never before in the memory of man had such a sight been seen. The sea was choked with timber. Ships of every design and lineage crowded the harbor. Long, black-hulled galleys with banks of 50 oars. Broad-beamed transports heavy with grain and wine. Swift cutters designed for scouting. They arrived in a ceaseless stream, their sails painting the horizon white. The beaches of Aulis vanished beneath the keels of 1,000 ships. The land behind the shore was transformed into a sprawling city of tents and huts, a temporary metropolis of leather and canvas that smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the sweat of 100,000 men. The noise was a physical weight, the hammering of armorers repairing shields, the shouting of captains drilling their crews, the bleating of goats brought for slaughter, and the constant, low rumble of soldiers telling stories of the gold that awaited them in Troy. It was a spectacle of supreme power, a demonstration of the collective might of the Achaean world. Yet, as the weeks turned into a month, a strange and terrifying silence began to descend upon this assembly of heroes. The wind stopped. The flags that had snapped proudly from the mastheads hung limp and lifeless. The sea turned into a sheet of polished glass, unmarred by even the slightest ripple. The heat became oppressive, a heavy blanket that sapped the strength of the warriors and soured the water in the casks. The great fleet, capable of crushing empires, was rendered impotent by the stillness of the air. It was as if the gods themselves had placed a hand over the mouth of the bay, forbidding their departure. Provisions began to run low. Temperaments frayed in the sweltering heat. Arguments broke out over petty grievances, and the unity of the army threatened to dissolve before a single spear had been thrown at Troy. Calchas, the seer who understood the language of birds and the will of the divine, revealed the terrible truth. The goddess Artemis was offended. She had halted the winds, and she demanded a price to release them. It was a price so high that it chilled the blood of Agamemnon, a king who thought himself above fear. The goddess demanded a life for the wind. Not a ram, not a bull, but the life of Iphigenia, the king's own daughter, the fairest flower of Mycenae. The struggle that waged within Agamemnon was a war of its own. On one side lay his love for his child, the primal instinct to protect one's own blood. On the other lay his duty to the army, his ambition, and the crushing weight of his brother's honor. For days he paced his tent, the sweat of anguish upon his brow, while the army outside grew more restless and the sea remained mockingly calm. Finally, the king succumbed to the commander. He sent for his daughter, deceiving his wife Clytemnestra with the lie that Iphigenia was to be married to the glorious Achilles before the fleet sailed. The arrival of the princess at Aulis was a moment of heartbreaking innocence set against a backdrop of grim necessity. She rode into the camp in a chariot, adorned in wedding finery, expecting to meet a groom, not an executioner. The realization, when it came, was a horror that no song could truly capture. The altar was not for a marriage, but for a sacrifice. The silence that fell over the assembled army as the girl was led to the stone was profound. Even the hardest veterans turned their eyes away. As the knife of the priest Calchas caught the light of the sun, the wind suddenly stirred. A breeze, cool and fresh, ruffled the hair of the soldiers and snapped the sails taut. The goddess had accepted the payment. The death of innocence bought the breath of war. With the wind howling once more through the rigging, the paralysis of Aulis was broken. The order to launch was given, a shout that echoed from ship to ship. The anchors were hauled up, dripping with mud. The oars bit deep into the water, churning it into white foam. One by one, the black ships turned their prows towards the east, towards the open Aegean and the distant coast of Asia. They sailed not as a disorganized rabble, but as a terrifying wave of bronze and wood. The sea groaned under their weight. At the fore sailed Agamemnon, his heart hardened to stone by the deed he had done. Behind him came the heroes of legend, Ajax the Great, towering above his men, Odysseus, plotting the fall of a city, Achilles, polishing his spear with a hunger for glory. They left behind a grieving mother who would nurse a hatred that would one day destroy the victor, but that was a tragedy for another time. Now there was only the destination, the 1,000 ships cut through the waves, a floating forest of vengeance, driven by a wind bought with blood, moving inexorably towards the plains of Troy where the fates waited with their shears open. The voyage across the open Aegean was a spectacle of terrifying majesty. For the watchers stationed on the high peaks of Imbros and Samothrace, the sea appeared to be moving, a dark carpet of wood and canvas sliding inexorably towards the Asian coast. The rhythmic beat of thousands of oars churned the blue waters into a white froth that trailed behind the fleet like a scar upon the ocean. Yet, as the coastline of the Troad finally rose from the mist, a long golden ribbon of sand backed by the green slopes of the plain, a strange hesitation gripped the armada. The ships slowed. The rowing ceased. The great fleet drifted in the swell, just out of bowshot from the shore, bobbing silently like a flock of uncertain seabirds. This hesitation was born of prophecy, the constant shadow that walked beside every hero of the age. It had been foretold by the oracles that the first Achaean to set his foot upon Trojan soil would be the first to die. The glory of being the first to land was outweighed by the certainty of immediate doom. So, the greatest army ever assembled floated in awkward silence, the captains looking at one another, the soldiers gripping their shields with sweaty palms, the waves lapping gently against the hulls. The Trojans, gathered on the dunes and the high walls of their citadel, watched this paralysis with bated breath, their weapons ready, their armor glinting under the midday sun. The stalemate was broken by Protesilaus. Whether driven by a desire for immortal fame that outweighed the fear of death, or simply by the unbearable tension of the weight, he leaped from the prow of his ship. His bronze greaves hit the wet sand with a heavy thud that seemed to echo across the entire bay. He raised his shield and took 3 strides forward, claiming the beach for Greece. The prophecy, swift and cruel, was fulfilled instantly. A Trojan spear, thrown by the waiting defenders, found its mark. Protesilaus fell. His blood, the first libation, poured onto the thirsty earth of Troy. But his sacrifice broke the spell. With a roar that drowned out the sound of the surf, the rest of the army followed. The landing was chaotic and immense. The shallow water churned with the legs of horses and men as they waded ashore. The air filled with the clash of bronze on bronze, the splintering of wood, and the cries of the dying. But the sheer weight of numbers was on the side of the invaders. The Trojans, realizing they could not hold the beach against such a tide, retreated in good order back to the safety of their high walls. They withdrew not in panic, but with the discipline of a people fighting for their homes, leaving the shoreline to the enemy. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, the nature of the invasion shifted from warfare to labor. The battle for the beach was over. The struggle for permanence began. The Achaeans did not merely pitch tents. They built a city. The first task was the ships. These were not vessels meant to remain at anchor. Using rollers made of polished logs and the brute strength of thousands of backs, the black ships were hauled up the beach, high above the high tide mark. They were arranged in rows, their masts lowered, their hulls propped up with timber struts, transforming the fleet into a wooden fortress wall facing the sea. Behind this barricade of ships, the camp took shape. It was a sprawling, organized chaos of logistics. The Myrmidons raised their huts of woven willow and clay near the station of Achilles on the far right flank. The followers of great Ajax secured the left. In the center, marking the authority of the High King, rose the pavilion of Agamemnon, a structure of heavy canvas and timber supports. The soldiers dug latrines, cleared scrub for fires, and established the boundaries of their new world. The smell of the camp changed from the metallic tang of blood to the domestic sense of wood smoke, roasting barley, and unwashed bodies. This was no raiding party that would plunder and leave. The Achaeans dug a deep trench around the landward side of their camp and erected a palisade of sharpened stakes. They were digging in. They brought with them artisans, blacksmiths to repair the swords that would dull against Trojan armor, leatherworkers to mend the straps of sandals worn thin by the march, and physicians to bind the wounds that would become a daily reality. The beach of Troy, once a pristine stretch of sand where fishermen cast their nets, had become an industrial complex of war. Up on the hill of Hizarlik, the lights of Troy flickered on as the twilight deepened. From the ramparts, King Priam and his sons looked down at the thousands of fires burning on the plain below, mirroring the stars above. The sight was sobering. The enemy was not a transient storm. They were a rising tide that had settled at their doorstep. The gates of the great Scaean gate were barred shut with heavy beams of oak. The siege had begun. But it was not a siege in the modern sense. The city was not fully encircled. The Achaeans controlled the sea and the immediate coast, but the Trojans still held the hinterland to the east and south. They could still harvest their crops, graze their cattle on the slopes of Ida, and receive allies from the interior of Anatolia. And so, a strange new rhythm of life established itself. It was the beginning of the long stalemate. Days turned into weeks and weeks into seasons. The initial adrenaline of the landing faded into a grinding routine. Each morning, the Achaeans would arm themselves and march out to the plain. Each morning, the great gates of Troy would open, and her defenders would stream out to meet them. They would clash in the dusty space between the two cities, the city of stone and the city of ships. Spears would shatter, men would die, heroes would taunt one another, and at sunset, both sides would retire to their fires to eat, sleep, and do it all again the next day. The landscape itself began to bear the scars of this endless conflict. The grass of the plain was trampled into hard-packed earth. The river Scamander ran red after every skirmish. The burial mounds of the fallen began to dot the landscape, small hills of sorrow rising from the flat ground. For 9 long years, this would be the state of the world. A war of attrition, of raids on neighboring towns, of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The great heroes. History often compresses time, reducing decades of struggle into a few dramatic sentences. But for the men who lived and died on the windy plains of Troy, time did not fly, it dragged. The war did not end in a week, nor in a year. The sun rose and set over the Scamander River 3,000 times, and still the walls of Troy stood. This era, known as the Long Stalemate, was not defined by decisive battles or grand strategies, but by the crushing weight of repetition. It became a war of attrition, a slow grinding of stone against bronze that wore down not just the weapons, but the souls of the warriors. The seasons brought their own distinct miseries. In the summers, the Anatolian heat was a physical hammer. The plain turned into a cauldron of dust. The armies would march out from the ships and the city gates, their movements kicking up clouds of fine, yellow grit that coated the skin, clogged the lungs, and dulled the shine of the armor. The metal of the breastplates became too hot to touch by midday, cooking the men inside their own protection. Water was scarce, the river reduced to a muddy trickle, and the flies were a torment that respected neither king nor slave. In the winters, the winds from the Thracian mountains screamed across the Hellespont, bringing driving rains that turned the battlefield into a quagmire of freezing mud. The chariot wheels sank to their axles, horses struggled and broke their legs. The soldiers in the beach camp huddled around smoky fires, wrapping themselves in rotting wool, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain on the canvas tents, dreaming of the hearths of Argos and Mycenae that they had not seen for nearly a decade. The combat itself settled into a grim ritual, as predictable as the tides. At dawn, the Achaeans would form their lines, the Myrmidons disciplined and silent, the men of Diomedes loud and eager, the contingents of Ajax solid as a wall. They would advance across the plain. The Trojans, fighting on their home ground, would meet them. There were days of intense fighting, where arrows darkened the sky like a flock of starlings and the clash of spears sounded like thunder. Heroes would duel, Hector against Ajax, Aeneas against Diomedes, trading blows that dented shields but rarely ended lives. But mostly, there were days of skirmishes, of probing attacks that gained a few yards of bloody earth only to surrender them again at sunset. It was a deadly dance where neither partner could lead. The Achaeans could not breach the massive walls of Troy without siege engines they did not possess. The Trojans could not drive the Achaeans into the sea against the fortress of their beached ships. To break the monotony and to feed the massive army, the war expanded outward. Since they could not take Troy itself, the Achaeans turned their aggression upon the surrounding towns and islands allied with Priam. Achilles, the swift-footed, led these raids with a terrifying efficiency. He sacked Lyrnessus, Pedasus, and Thebe, plundering cattle, grain, and gold. It was during these raids that the seeds of future disaster were sown, not in the form of weapons, but in the form of captives. Women were taken as prizes of war, living trophies to be distributed among the kings. From Lyrnessus came Briseis, a woman of royal bearing who was given to Achilles. From Thebe came Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo, who was claimed by Agamemnon. These acquisitions were treated as mundane matters of distribution, entries in a ledger of spoils, yet they were the sparks that would eventually burn down the Achaean camp. Inside the city of Troy, life had shrunk to the confines of the citadel. The lower town was largely abandoned, its people moved within the safety of the upper walls. King Priam, his beard now snow-white, sat on the ramparts day after day, watching the endless ebb and flow of the tide of war. He saw his sons return evening after evening, their armor battered, their bodies scarred, and he saw the pyres of those who did not return. Helen, the cause of all this sorrow, lived a life of isolation. She wove a great tapestry in her chambers, a crimson web depicting the struggles of the Trojans and Achaeans for her sake. She was both the author and the subject of the tragedy, trapped in a gilded cage while men died for her name just outside her window. The women of Troy looked at her with cold eyes, whispering that she was a curse sent by the gods, beautiful and deadly. The ships on the beach began to rot. The timber, once seasoned and strong, grew soft with seaworm and damp. The rigging frayed. The sails, furled for years, became brittle. The army that had arrived with bronze shining like fire was now an army of rust and patched leather. Men who had sailed as youths were now in their 30s, their faces lined by the sun and the stress of constant vigilance. They had forgotten the faces of their wives. Their children were growing up as strangers in distant lands. A deep, pervasive melancholy settled over the camp. The glory of the expedition had faded, replaced by a stubborn, grim determination to simply endure. They could not leave without victory, for that would be shame eternal. But victory seemed as distant as the stars. And so the 9th year drew to a close. The stalemate seemed absolute. The gods on Olympus, who had watched the sport with interest, grew bored or plotted new interventions. The balance of power was perfect, held in place by the tension of 10,000 spears. But tension, when maintained for too long, eventually snaps. The atmosphere in the Achaean camp grew toxic. The resentment between the kings, simmering under the lid of discipline, was reaching a boiling point. The heat of the pestilence was coming, and with it, the rage that would finally break the deadlock. The long stalemate was about to end, not with a whimper, but with a scream that would echo through the ages. The stalemate that had paralyzed the Trojan plain for nearly a decade was not broken by a grand strategy or a siege engine, but by a flaw in the human heart. It began with a silence that was louder than the clash of armies. In the Achaean camp, the air grew heavy with the stench of sickness. Apollo, the distant archer, angered by the insult to his priest, rained invisible arrows of plague down upon the invaders. The funeral pyres burned day and night, their thick, oily smoke blotting out the sun. It was in the shadow of this pestilence that the fragile unity of the Greek kings finally shattered. Agamemnon, forced to return his own war prize to appease the god, turned his greed upon Achilles, seizing the woman Briseis from him. It was an insult that cut deeper than any Trojan blade. Achilles, the greatest of warriors, the man whose very name made enemies tremble, did not draw his sword against his king. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He stopped. He withdrew to his ships on the far end of the beach. He sat in his tent, wrapped in a sullen, brooding darkness, strumming a lyre while his countrymen died. The Myrmidons, his elite shock troops, sat idle, their armor gathering dust, their spears stacked like firewood. Without the terrifying presence of Achilles on the field, the balance of the war shifted instantly. The Trojans, sensing the absence of the predator, became the hunters. Led by Hector, the tamer of horses, the Trojan army surged forward like a dam breaking. For the first time in years, they pushed the Greeks back from the plain, back across the trench, and right up to the hulls of their beached ships. The sky turned red not with sunset, but with fire. Hector, blazing with the favor of Zeus, hurled a torch onto a Greek galley, and the flames leaped high, threatening to consume the only means of escape the invaders possessed. Panic swept through the camp. The roar of the battle was deafening, a cacophony of screaming men and crackling timber. In the cool shadow of Achilles' tent, Patroclus watched the disaster unfold. He was the companion of Achilles, his other half, a man of gentler heart but equal courage. He could not bear to see his friends slaughtered while the greatest weapon of Greece sat polishing a shield. He begged Achilles for permission to fight, or at least to wear his armor to frighten the Trojans. With the mere image of the hero, Achilles, his heart still hardened by pride, relented only halfway. He allowed Patroclus to don the divine armor, to take the chariot and the immortal horses, but warned him to only drive the Trojans from the ships, not to pursue them to the walls. The sight of Achilles returning to the field turned the tide of battle in a heartbeat. The Trojans, seeing the familiar crested helmet and the sun-gleaming breastplate, broke in terror. They fled across the plain, believing the god of death had returned to claim them. Patroclus, intoxicated by the rush of combat and the power of the armor he wore, forgot the warning. He chased the fleeing enemy to the very gates of Troy. Their destiny caught him. It was not a fair fight. First, he was struck by Apollo, who stripped him of his borrowed armor, leaving him dazed and vulnerable. Then, he was wounded by a lesser soldier. Finally, Hector delivered the killing blow, driving his spear into the belly of the man he thought was Achilles. The news traveled back to the ships not as a rumor, but as a shockwave. When Antilochus delivered the message, "Patroclus is dead," Achilles did not speak. He poured dust over his head and lay in the dirt, his grief a primal, animalistic thing. The cry he let out was so terrible that his mother Thetis heard it from the depths of the sea. The grief transformed instantly into a cold, white-hot rage. The Menes, the wrath that Homer would sing of, descended upon him. It was no longer about Briseis or Agamemnon or honor. It was about extinction. He returned to the war not as a soldier, but as a force of nature. He possessed no armor, for Hector had stripped it from Patroclus's body, until the god Hephaestus forged him a new set, a shield that contained the entire cosmos on its surface. When Achilles stepped onto the battlefield the next morning, the river Scamander choked on the corpses of the men he slew. He did not fight, he butchered. He drove the Trojan army back into their city like sheep into a pen. Only one man remained outside the Scaean gate. Hector stood alone. His parents wept from the walls, begging him to come inside, but his honor, heavy as a stone, kept him rooted to the spot. He knew, with the clarity of the doomed, that his time had come. When Achilles approached, shining like the star of autumn that brings fever to men, even Hector's courage faltered. He ran. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy, the hunter and the hunted, while the gods watched from the peaks of Olympus. But one cannot outrun fate. Athena, in disguise, tricked Hector into stopping and facing his enemy. The duel was brief and brutal. Spears were thrown and missed. Swords were drawn. But Achilles, knowing the weak points of his own old armor that Hector now wore, found the gap at the neck. He drove his spear through the throat of the prince of Troy. Hector fell in the dust, his soul fleeing to the house of Hades, prophesying with his dying breath the death of Achilles himself. But Achilles was beyond reason. The death of his enemy did not quench his fire. He pierced Hector's ankles, threaded leather straps through them, and tied the body to the back of his chariot. In full view of the weeping King Priam and the screaming Andromache, Achilles whipped his horses. He dragged the body of Troy's protector through the dust, around the city walls, and back to the Greek camp. It was an act of desecration that horrified both men and gods. The sun set on a changed world. The greatest defender of Troy was dead, his body broken in the dirt. Achilles sat in his tent once more, not in sulking silence, but in the exhausted, hollow silence of a man who has killed a part of himself. The rage had burned everything down, leaving only ashes and the waiting shadow of his own death. The death of Hector did not bring the silence of peace to the plains of Troy. It brought the silence of a held breath, a suspended moment of collective horror. For 12 days, the body of the city's defender lay in the dust beside the ships of the Myrmidons. Achilles, in his madness, sought to defile it day after day, dragging it behind his chariot in a grim ritual of grief. But the gods, who watch over the dignity of men even in death, preserved the flesh of the prince. Apollo wrapped the body in a golden aegis, keeping it unblemished by the stones and the sun, a silent rebuke to the brutality of the victor. Inside the high walls of Ilion, the wailing had ceased, replaced by a hollow, aching despair. King Priam, the ruler of a burning world, sat in the ashes of his palace courtyard. He had not eaten, he had not slept, and he had not washed the dirt from his face since the moment his son fell. His cloak was pulled over his head, a shroud for a living man. The city around him felt like a tomb, but in the depths of the 12th night, a command came from the heavens, delivered by the rainbow-winged Iris. The king was to do the unthinkable. He was to go alone into the belly of the beast. He was to cross the enemy lines, enter the camp of the Achaeans, and ransom the body of his son from the man who killed him. The preparations were made in secret. A mule cart was loaded with treasures. Robes of softest wool, tunics, tripods of bronze, cauldrons of glittering copper, and talents of gold. A ransom fit for a god. Priam did not take an army with him. He took only an elderly herald, Idaeus, to drive the mules. The great gates of Troy opened with a groan that seemed too loud in the stillness of the night, and the old king rolled out into the darkness. The journey across the plain was a passage through a nightmare landscape. The moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, casting the battlefield into deep shadow. They passed the mounds of the dead, the broken hulks of chariots, and the scavenging dogs that slunk away into the gloom. The river Scamander murmured in the dark, washing over stones that were still stained. Yet they were not stopped. Hermes, the messenger god, the guide of souls, walked beside them unseen. He cast a sleep over the Achaean sentries, blinding their eyes and dulling their ears, allowing the mule cart to pass through the ditch, through the palisade, and into the heart of the enemy camp as if they were nothing more than a drift of mist. They arrived at the shelter of Achilles. It was a high-roof structure made of pine timbers and thatched with downy reeds gathered from the meadows. The gate was barred by a massive beam of fir that 3 ordinary men struggled to lift, but which the god opened with a touch. Priam stepped down from the cart. He left the herald behind and walked alone into the lion's den. Inside, the room was lit by the soft, flickering glow of oil lamps. Achilles sat in a chair, finished with his evening meal, his companions sitting apart in respectful silence. The air was warm and smelled of wine and roasted meat, a stark contrast to the cold wind outside. Priam entered unnoticed until he was at the very feet of the warrior. In a movement of supreme humility that would echo through the ages, the king of Troy knelt. He reached out with his aged, trembling hands, hands that had held a scepter, hands that had blessed 1,000 children, and he clasped the knees of Achilles. He took the hands of the manslayer, the terrible hands that had murdered so many of his sons, and he kissed them. The shock in the room was absolute. Achilles looked down, stunned to see the king of Troy at his feet, looking so much like his own aging father, Peleus, whom he would never see again. Priam spoke, his voice cracking with the weight of his sorrow. He did not speak of politics or war. He spoke of fatherhood. He asked Achilles to remember his own father, an old man waiting in distant Phthia for news of his son. He spoke of the misery of outliving one's children, of the emptiness of a house where the best and bravest are gone. "I have endured," Priam whispered, "what no other mortal on earth has endured. I have brought my lips to the hands of the man who killed my child." The rage that had hardened Achilles' heart like iron for so many days suddenly shattered. The memory of his own father, and the realization of his own impending death, unlocked the grief he had been suppressing. He took the old king's hand and gently pushed him back. And there, in the quiet of the tent, the 2 enemies wept together. Achilles wept for his own father and for Patroclus. Priam wept for Hector. Their lamentations mingled, rising to the roof of the hut, a shared language of loss that transcended the hatred of the war. When the weeping subsided, Achilles sprang from his chair. He raised the old man by the hand, honoring his gray head and gray beard. The warrior had returned. The butcher was gone. He ordered his serving women to wash and anoint the body of Hector, but to do so out of Priam's sight, lest the king's grief turn to anger upon seeing the wounds, and Achilles' rage be kindled once more. The body was clothed in beautiful tunics and lifted onto the wagon. Achilles then did something even more extraordinary. He prepared a meal for Priam and they ate together, the wolf and the sheep breaking bread. He promised the king a truce. He asked how many days Priam needed to bury his son properly. 11 days, the king requested. 9 days to mourn him in our halls, 1 day to burn him, and on the 11th day we will build his mound. On the 12th we will fight again if we must. Achilles pledged his word. For 12 days the spears would be lowered. Priam slept on the porch of the tent that night, but Hermes woke him before dawn, warning him that Agamemnon would not be so merciful if he were found. The king and his herald yoked the mules and drove out of the camp while the Achaeans still slept. They returned to Troy as the first light of dawn, saffron-robed, spread over the earth. Cassandra, standing on the citadel, was the first to see them. Her scream announced the return of the prince. The city gates were thrown open. The people of Troy surged out to meet the wagon, their cries of grief tearing the air. They touched the head of the corpse, they touched the wheels of the cart. Hector had come home. For 9 days, the wood was gathered from the forests of Ida. On the 10th day, they placed Hector on the pyre at the highest point of the plain. The fire was lit, and the flames roared into the sky, consuming the body of the tamer of horses, turning flesh into white bone and ash. The next morning, they quenched the embers with dark wine and gathered the bones into a golden urn, burying it deep in the earth and piling heavy stones over it. They returned to the palace for the funeral feast, eating in the shadow of their doom. The truce held, but the air was heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The Iliad of Homer ends here, not with the fall of the city, but with the burial of a horse tamer. The rage of Achilles had burned itself out, replaced by a solemn, tragic understanding of mortality. But the war was not over. The fire that consumed Hector's pyre was but a prelude to the fire that would soon consume the stones of Troy itself. The death of the protector meant the death of the city was now inevitable. The fates had spun the final thread. The death of Hector was a mortal wound to the spirit of Troy, yet the city itself refused to die. The massive limestone walls, built by the hands of gods, remained impervious to the bronze of men. The war dragged on, bloody and inconclusive, claiming new victims with every turning of the moon. Achilles, the invincible, finally met his doom near the Scaean gate, an arrow guided by Apollo finding the vulnerability in his heel. Paris, the architect of the war, fell soon after, struck down by a poisoned shaft. But even with the board cleared of its most powerful pieces, the stalemate held. The Achaeans, exhausted by 10 years of futility, looked at the impregnable fortress and realized that strength alone would never crack the nut of Iliad. The time for the spear had passed. The time for the mind had arrived. It was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, he of the twisting mind and endless stratagems, who conceived the final play. Legend says the inspiration came from watching a horse charge a wall, or perhaps from a small votive figurine, but the plan he laid before the Council of Kings was born of pure, desperate genius. They would achieve by guile what they could not achieve by force. They would weaponize the piety of the Trojans against them. The construction of the device was entrusted to Hippias, a master carpenter and boxer, whose hands could shape wood as easily as they could crush bone. The slopes of Mount Ida, which had provided the timber for Paris's ships so long ago, were once again stripped of their pines and firs. But this time, the axes did not shape keels and masts. They shaped ribs and flanks. Under the supervision of Odysseus, a structure of terrifying magnitude began to rise on the beach. It was a horse, colossal in scale, its belly hollowed out to form a dark, claustrophobic chamber. The craftsmanship was exquisite and unsettling. The planks were fitted so tightly that not a sliver of light could penetrate the interior. The legs were thick pillars of oak, sturdy enough to hold the weight of the armed men who would hide within. The eyes were inlaid with colored stones that seemed to watch the horizon. A concealed hatch was engineered into the flank, hidden so perfectly that the seams were invisible to the naked eye. On one side of the creature, an inscription was carved in large, archaic letters. For their return home, the Achaeans dedicate this offering to Athena. It was a lie carved in wood, a poison pill wrapped in the guise of a sacred gift. The selection of the men to enter the horse was a somber affair. To climb into the belly of the beast was to accept a suicide mission. If the plan failed, if the Trojans burned the horse or threw it from the cliffs, there would be no escape. Odysseus led the way, followed by Menelaus, Diomedes, the builder Hippias, and a handful of the bravest captains. They entered the cramped darkness, their armor muffled with wool to prevent any clatter. The hatch was sealed. The air inside was hot, stagnant, and thick with the smell of resin and the sweat of terrified men. They sat in absolute silence, waiting for the performance to begin. Outside, the rest of the Achaean army executed the second half of the deception. They struck their tents. They burned their camp, destroying the wooden huts that had been their home for a decade. They launched their black ships, but they did not sail for Greece. Instead, they rowed silently to the far side of the island of Tenedos, hiding the fleet in the shadow of the cliffs, waiting for the signal. When the sun rose over the Troad the next morning, the sentries on the walls of Troy saw a sight that defied belief. The beach was empty. The smoke of the burning camp drifted lazily into the sky. The ships were gone. The horizon was clear. After 10 years of siege, the enemy had vanished. A cautious hope, fragile as glass, spread through the city. The great gates were unbarred. The people of Troy, blinking in the sunlight, walked out onto the plain that had been a killing field for so long. They wandered through the ashes of the Greek camp, marveling at the silence. And then they found it. The horse stood alone on the sand, towering over the curious crowd. It was an object of awe and suspicion. Arguments broke out immediately. Some, like the priest Laocoon, warned that it was a trick, famously crying out that he feared the Greeks even when bearing gifts. He hurled a spear at the horse's flank, and the wood boomed with a hollow echo that nearly stopped the hearts of the men hiding inside. But the gods were working against Troy. Sea serpents rose from the deep and devoured Laocoon and his sons, a terrifying omen that the Trojans interpreted as divine punishment for desecrating the offering to Athena. Convinced that the horse was a sacred object that would bring the protection of the goddess to their city, King Priam ordered it to be brought inside. The structure was so immense that it would not fit through the Scaean gate. In a final, tragic irony, the Trojans tore down a section of their own impregnable walls, the very walls that had held back Achilles, to drag their destruction into the heart of the citadel. It was a labor of joy. Ropes were attached to the wooden hooves. Boys and girls sang hymns as they pulled. The wheels groaned under the weight. 4 times the horse halted on the threshold, and 4 times the sound of armor clashing inside was drowned out by the festivities. Night fell upon a city delirious with relief. The war was over. The Greeks were gone. Wine flowed like the Scamander River. Feasts were held in every house. The guards, drunk and exhausted, fell asleep at their posts. The silence that settled over Troy was not the silence of vigilance, but the heavy, stuporous silence of the intoxicated. In the belly of the horse, Odysseus felt the vibrations of the city die down. He waited until the moon was high. Then, Hippias unbolted the hatch. A breath of cool night air rushed into the stifling chamber. A rope ladder was lowered. One by one, the phantom warriors descended into the sleeping city. They did not cheer. They moved with the efficiency of butchers. They killed the few sentries silently, then opened the city gates. From the walls, a torch was waved, a signal to the waiting fleet at Tenedos. The black ships, which had been creeping back under the cover of darkness, beached once more. The Achaean army poured through the broken section of the wall and the open gates like a dark flood. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The accumulated rage of 10 years was unleashed in a single night. Torches were thrown into the houses. The dry timber of the roofs caught instantly, and soon the city became a beacon of fire visible for miles. The Trojans woke to the smell of smoke and the screams of the dying. They fought in doorways, in alleys, half-armed and bewildered, but they were swept away. King Priam was cut down at his own household altar. The noble women of Troy were dragged from their sanctuaries. The infant son of Hector was thrown from the ramparts, ending the line of kings. The fire consumed everything. The great palaces of cedar and stone, the temples of the gods, the markets, the weaving rooms, all were fed to the flames. The horse stood in the center of the citadel, lit by the inferno, a silent wooden witness to the genocide it had birthed. By the time the rosy-fingered dawn touched the east, the city of Ilion was no more. It was a smoking ruin, a heap of blackened stones and ash. The war was won, but at a cost that would haunt the victors for the rest of their days. The Bronze Age had burned itself out in one night of fire and blood. When the last Greek ship disappeared over the horizon, their hulls heavy with gold and weeping captives, silence returned to the Troad. It was not the peaceful silence of the era before the war, but the heavy, mournful silence of a graveyard. The great city of Ilion, which had once shone like a beacon at the mouth of the Hellespont, was now a scar of blackened stone and ash. The wind, the eternal master of this landscape, began its work immediately. It blew the dust of the plain over the ruins, softening the sharp edges of the destruction. Winter rains washed the blood from the stones. Grass, patient and relentless, pushed its way through the cracks in the paved streets where heroes had once walked. Time, the great eraser, moved forward. Centuries turned into millennia. The survivors scattered. The stories passed from lips to ears, growing taller and more fantastic with each telling. The reality of the war, the mud, the hunger, the smell of fear, faded away, leaving behind only the polished gold of the myth. The site itself was not entirely abandoned. New people came. The Iolian Greeks built a temple to Athena on the ruins. The Romans, claiming descent from the Trojan refugee Aeneas, built a new city, Ilium Novum, to honor their ancestors. Emperors like Augustus and Hadrian visited the site to pay homage to the ghosts of Hector and Achilles. But eventually even Rome fell. The earthquakes came, toppling the marble columns. The harbors silted up, pushing the sea miles away from the citadel. The name Troy vanished from the maps, existing only in the verses of poets. The hill came to be known simply as Hizarlik, the place of the fortress, in the language of the Turks who settled the land. To the local farmers, it was just a mound where the wind blew hard and the view was good, a place to graze sheep, unaware that they were walking on the heads of kings. By the 19th century, the War of Troy was considered by learned men to be a fairy tale, a fiction no more real than the battles of giants and dragons. But there was one man who refused to accept this. Heinrich Schliemann was not a scholar. He was a businessman, a dreamer, and perhaps a bit of a madman. He had learned ancient Greek just to read Homer in the original tongue. He believed, with a fervor that bordered on religious zeal, that the Iliad was not a book of myths, but a map. While the academics argued that Troy was a fantasy, Schliemann took his fortune and his shovel to the hill of Hizarlik. In the 1870s, the silence of the hill was broken once again, not by the clash of swords, but by the strike of pickaxes. Schliemann dug with a brutal efficiency, tearing through the earth with a haste that would horrify modern archaeologists. He was looking for the Troy of Priam, the city of the burning. He dug a massive trench, the Great North-South Trench, slicing through the mound like a knife through a layer cake. And what he found changed our understanding of history forever. He did not find one city, he found 9. The hill of Hizarlik was a layer cake of civilizations, built one on top of the other over a span of 3,000 years. Troy I, the oldest, was a small fortress of the early Bronze Age. Troy II, with its imposing ramps and megara, Schliemann mistakenly identified as the city of the Iliad. It was here, in the dusty wall of the trench, that he saw the glint of gold. He dismissed his workers and dug the object out with his own hands and his wife's knife. It was a hoard of copper shields, silver vases, and diadems of pure gold, woven from thousands of tiny pieces. He named it Priam's treasure, adorning his wife Sophia with the jewelry of a queen who had died 1,000 years before Helen was even born. Schliemann had found the wrong layer, but he had proven the essential truth. The legend was rooted in reality. Later archaeologists, Dorpfeld, Blegen, Korfmann, would refine the picture with more care. They identified Troy VI and Troy VIA as the likely candidates for Homer's war. These layers showed signs of immense wealth, massive defensive walls, the very walls described in the epic, and, crucially, signs of violent destruction. They found skeletons in the streets, piles of sling stones stockpiled for a siege, and a layer of charcoal and ash that spoke of a catastrophic fire around 1200 BC. The archaeological evidence paints a picture less romantic than the poems, but no less tragic. There were no gods throwing lightning bolts. There may not have been a wooden horse. Some historians suggest the horse was a metaphor for an earthquake. Poseidon was the earthshaker, or a siege engine. The war was likely fought not for the beauty of a woman, but for the control of the trade routes that passed through the Dardanelles, for copper and gold and grain. Yet, standing on the windy hill of Hizarlik today, the dry facts of archaeology seem to fade before the power of the story. The wind still blows from the north, just as it did when it filled Agamemnon's sails. The plain still stretches out to the glittering sea. The island of Tenedos still sits on the horizon like a sleeping beast. The mound of Achilles still rises from the flat earth, a lonely monument to glory and death. The boundaries between the myth and the earth blur here. Whether Helen truly walked these ramparts, or whether she was a symbol of a dying age, matters little to the visitor who listens to the wind. The story of Troy is the story of humanity itself, our capacity for creation and destruction, for great love and terrible cruelty, for building walls to keep out the world and for devising tricks to tear them down. The city burned, the heroes died, and the gold was buried. But the song remains. It has outlived the stone, the bronze, and the empires. And as long as there are those who listen to the whispers of the past, the fire of Troy will never truly go out.